Hey Crossway students, so great to be with you in this particular way. And as we kind of finish up our semester and really head into our summer, where I'm hoping and praying that we'll get to connect in some new and different ways, I was trying to figure out what would be a good way to finish out our semester. What would be maybe a topic or a passage that would really help us kind of wrap some things up and finish well. And as I thought about that and as I prayed about that, one idea just kept coming to my mind. Some might call it a discipline, some might call it an art, some might call it a habit, but it's this simple thing that I think that I would like to talk to you guys about tonight. Every one of us needs to learn how to remember. We need to learn how to remember. Yes, remember. That may sound a little goofy to even talk about remembering something, but I think we need to learn how to remember something, actually important things, on purpose. Turn in your Bibles to Joshua chapter 4. Joshua chapter 4 has actually become one of my favorite parts of the Old Testament. A few years ago, as I was taking some of my Old Testament classes in seminary, I got to camp out in this passage a little bit, and it really ministered to my soul and encouraged my faith. And I want to just talk about this passage a little bit tonight and how it talks about remembering what God has done. So I'll give you a little context as you turn to Joshua chapter 4. Joshua is now the leader of the Israelites. Moses has died, has kind of passed on the reins of leadership to Joshua. God has actually given him the reins to be the leader, and they're on their way to the promised land. But there's only one problem. Well, there's a few, but there's one right in front of them, and it's the River Jordan. It was a big river that they needed to cross, and they didn't just need to cross it with a handful of people, but they needed to take lots of people with them. Later in the chapter, we won't read this part, but it said that they had 40,000 people fit for war. And so that doesn't just mean that was their total amount, but they had far more than that coming with them. But they needed to cross the River Jordan. And in this cool moment of Scripture, God stops the flow of the River Jordan. And what he does is he enables his people, the Israelites, to walk over it and to cross it without getting wet. He protects them, not just obviously from getting wet, but if they had tried to cross in that moment, in that place without that, many would have died. They wouldn't have made it. And so he provisionally cares for them by parting the water, showing off his power, and taking them to the other side. But let's take a look at Joshua chapter 4. I want to read verses 1 through 8 together. When all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, Take 12 stones from here, out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you, and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight." Then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, and a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel. That this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, 'What do these stones mean to you?' Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. And when it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever." And then the first part of verse 8 just says, "And the people of Israel did just as Joshua commanded," and then unpacks it a little bit more. Israel did what God commanded. All of Israel passed unharmed across the river, and then they set up these memorial stones, these stones that were meant to point to this moment, to point particularly to God's power and God's work on behalf of his people. You see, they witnessed something incredible. In fact, they experienced something incredible, and they were told to do something to remind them of the power of God, of his love for them, of his care for them in that moment. And he even says that when your children ask, I want you to tell them about what I've done. Now, I want us to think for a moment about kind of what does this mean for us? We're going to unpack this a little bit more, but I want us to think, what does this passage kind of communicate for us? Because it really is all about God was caring for the Israelites. God was taking care of them in his process of delivering them to where he promised he would take them. And these memorial stones were all about his glory and his honor and his power. So what does that mean for us? Well, I think one of the principles we can learn here, it's not the main point of this text, but one of the principles we can learn here is that God calls us to remember him, to remember his faithfulness, to remember his power, to remember what he's done. Now, you might be thinking, well, Ryan, but God didn't ask the people of Israel to camp out in front of the Jordan and stay in their tent for 2 months like we have to at this safer at home moment. Well, I get that. It's a very different kind of thing they're walking through. But I think it's so valuable for us to try to connect the dots a little bit and for us to think about what might God be doing right now in our lives that we shouldn't forget. Or what might God have done in the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years of our life that we should not forget. In fact, that we should remember more regularly on purpose. You see, we're so bad at slowing down. We're so bad at considering what's been going on. We're so bad at thinking about these huge moments of God's power, God's provision, God's grace in our lives, that we miss out on moments of remembering that can bring hope, that can bring peace, that can bring courage, and that can really help us in moments that we're really struggling. So I want to give you 4 things that you can do, 4 ways that you can get better at remembering all that God has done or specific moments that God has worked. And the first one is just simple. It's think about it. Just simple. Think about it. You see, these memorial stones that were in place in this text were there to remind them and help them think about what God has done. To think about it. I love Psalm 77:12. It's one of the many places where we're told to remember or think about God. But it says, I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. It's this moment where the psalmist is saying, I'm going to do this. I'm going to think. I'm going to remember what you've done for me. Do we do this? Like, honestly, do we do this? Do we think about how God has worked in our lives regularly? Do we think through the ways he's answered prayer, the ways he's provided for us, the ways he's taught us things, or the gifts he's given us? Do we think about these things regularly? Do we return to them like these monument stones to remind us of God's power at work in our lives? Now, I realize one of the joys of living for a long period of time is the longer we live, the more opportunities we have to watch God work. But I think even at your age, whether you're a 6th grader or a 12th grader or a parent watching along, you've had opportunities to see God put his power on display in your life and in the lives of others. So let me just ask you, what has God done in your life during this hard season over the past few months? Is there something that you need to think about as a part of remembering, that you need to think about how God has worked? Or maybe just in the last 2 or 3 or 4 years, or even just over your lifetime, there's got to be things that you need to consider, to think about as you seek to remember all that God has done. But I don't just want you to think about it. I also want you to turn and thank him for it. So think about it and then thank him for it. While Joshua 4 doesn't explicitly state or call the Israelites to thank God for taking them across the Jordan, I think it's implicit. When they're remembering the power of God at work in their lives, they're thanking him for it. They're saying, God, you're amazing. Thank you for taking us. Thank you for bringing us. Thank you for protecting us. Thank you for fulfilling your promises. They're thanking him for what he has done in their lives. I love Psalm 9:1, which says, I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart. I will recount all of your wonderful deeds. Look at that phrasing. God is calling us as his people to give thanks for who he is and what he's done. Giving thanks is key to remembering. I've actually found, and I can't unpack this in its fullness, it's something we'll talk about a lot over the next few years if you spend time with me, is that thankfulness is one of the best ways to fight all kinds of struggles in your life. Whether it's depression, anxiety, fear, hopelessness, anger, even sexual sin, there are so many applications of gratitude and thankfulness to the way that we handle those struggles in our life. So let me ask you that question again, but with a little different spin. What has God done for you or in you in this past few months that you need to be thankful for? Not just think about it, but thank him for it. That'd be a great way to start even this evening, to think about something and to pray about that same thing in thanksgiving, thanking God for what he's done. But here's another one that I want you to think about as we're thinking about these 4 ways to remember, to grow in remembering what God has done. I want you to try something with it. Now, I want to unpack this one a little bit. This doesn't have to be go make a memorial stone like we see in Joshua 4. Although I've seen people do that and write things down that God has done and keep them in places around their house. I think that's totally fine. But that's not like something God is saying you need to do. But I want to encourage you. Maybe there's something you want to try in order to remember. And so maybe you're an artist. Maybe you like to do art. Well, maybe you need to create something that will remind you of what God has done in this season or in your life, in a different moment of your life. Maybe you're a musician. What if you learned a piece or wrote a piece or did something kind of with music that would solidify some way to remember what God has done in your life? Maybe you like to journal, so write something down in your journal. Maybe you're a photographer. Maybe you could artistically grab a picture or take a series of pictures to remind you about what God has done in your life. Maybe it's just as simple as grabbing that pen and writing somewhere in your Bible a moment, a key thing God has done in your life, either recently or even a long time ago. But try something with it. Once again, we see this in this moment where God actually calls the Israelites to grab these stones from the Jordan and set them up so that it can remind them of what he's done. Well, maybe you can do something like that in your own life. And then the 4th way that you can grow in remembering is just simply tell others about it. When there's something that God has done in your life recently or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, we talk about it. We tell people about it. See, God's work in your life is often meant to encourage or help others in their life. Look at Joshua 4 again with me. I want to read kind of the back end of this passage, verses 19 through 24. I want you to see something clearly about what God was trying to do here with the people of Israel, and I think it applies to us as we think about our role in God's story. Verse 19 starts with this. The people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the 1st month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. That's where they were heading. And those 12 stones, which they took up out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and that you may fear the Lord your God forever. Do you see it? It was for generations that they wanted to put God on display. God was saying, as you tell your children, not just your children will know, but that the world may know how mighty I am. So when God shows up and does something awesome in your life, whether it's small or big or somewhere in between, tell someone about it. That's how we kind of continue to remember what God has done. Tell someone about it. And don't stop talking about it. Sometimes we just want to say it one time and be done, but don't stop bragging on God and what he's done in your life and in the lives of others. So this kind of brings me to just the last question. Will we, maybe I'll say it this way, will you remember what God has done in this season of your life, in this season of hardship in the last few months? Will you remember things and ways that God has worked? Or if you make it a bigger question, will you remember the ways God has worked throughout your life? Will we be great at remembering? Will these moments that we remember fuel our faith? Because I think they can. Will these memories that we remember sustain our hope? Because they can build that up in us. They can keep us going. Or will we be a, what have you done for me lately kind of Christian? Let me say that one more time, because I think that's something we think but never say out loud. We become this kind of Christian that just looks at God and says, well, what have you done for me lately? Rather than just speaking to our own hearts and saying, no. Look at all God has done in your life, Ryan. Look at all God has done in your life. Put your name in there. Let's remember those things. Let's also remember that the greatest thing that we should be thinking about and remembering is the gospel. If you're a Christian, if you've put your faith in Jesus and experienced that grace from him, then we need to daily remind ourselves of what Christ has done for us. We need to daily think about it, thank him for it, try to remember it, and tell other people about it. And if you haven't experienced that faith in Jesus, that grace that you can receive, that hope for eternity, that abundant life through him, we'd love to talk to you more about it. Maybe you could chat with your parents or with a friend, or feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you about how this could change your life forever. So in just a moment, we're going to put a few questions up on the screen. And students, I'd love for you to consider these questions as you head to group time later this evening. Write something down in a notebook. Answer a few of these questions as you think about, how does this personally apply to my life? If I could sum it all up for you, is what do you need to remember about what God has done for you? How can you think about it? How can you thank him for it? How can you try something with it? And how can you tell others about God's work in your life? Let's not get discouraged about what's going on today. Let's lean into the moments where God has shown up in our life, and let's give him thanks. Let's remember him, his power, his might. And just like the Israelites in Joshua chapter 4, where we have these ways of remembering his power, thanking him for his greatness, and putting him on display for all to see. Students, I love you. I'll see you guys a little bit later.